Let me be very clear with you right now. What you are watching in the Strait of Hormuz is not a crisis. It is not a miscalculation. It is not some accidental byproduct of American bombs falling on Iranian soil. What you are watching is the most perfectly executed long-term strategic play in the history of modern geopolitics. And almost nobody in the Western media has the intellectual framework to understand what they are actually looking at. So I am going to explain it to you. And when I am finished, you are going to realize that everything you thought you knew about this conflict, about China, about Iran, about who is winning and who is losing, is almost completely wrong. Let's start with the basics. Because the basics matter. Because the basics are what the commentators on CNN and the analysts at Brookings and the think tankers in Washington keep getting fundamentally catastrophically wrong. They are looking at this situation through a linear lens. They see America with its aircraft carriers, its stealth bombers, its Operation Epic Fury, and they think in straight lines. Strength projects forward, weakness retreats. That is their model of the world. That is all they know. But the world, and this is the first thing you need to internalize if you want to actually understand geopolitics, the world does not move in straight lines. It moves in cycles. It moves in spirals. And the most dangerous players in this game are the ones who understand that simple, devastating truth. Now let me ask you a question. When do you think China started planning for this moment? Last year? 5 years ago? Think harder. Because the 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership between Beijing and Tehran was not signed in 2021 as some kind of diplomatic formality. That agreement, $400 billion in Chinese investment into Iranian infrastructure, Iranian oil flowing to China at heavily discounted rates, Chinese technology transfers, Chinese financial networks building parallel systems to circumvent Western sanctions. That agreement was the visible surface of something that had been building layer by layer for over a decade. The roots of this arrangement go back to approximately 2013-2014, when Xi Jinping first articulated the Belt and Road Initiative, and the strategists in Zhongnanhai looked at a map and identified Iran's geography as the single most important piece of real estate between East Asia and Europe. China did not stumble into this partnership with Iran. China chose Iran. China needed Iran. And China, in its patient, methodical, non-Western way, built the architecture for exactly the scenario that is now unfolding before your eyes. Think about what Iran actually controls. Think about it not emotionally, not through the lens of ideology or religion or American foreign policy. Think about it structurally. The Strait of Hormuz is a passage 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that passage flows approximately 20% of the world's oil supply. Liquefied natural gas from Qatar, crude from Saudi Arabia, energy from the UAE, energy from Kuwait, energy from Iraq. And now, in April 2026, Iran, battered by American and Israeli airstrikes, its nuclear facilities degraded, its missile capabilities suppressed, is sitting at that toll booth and charging ships in Chinese yuan, not dollars, yuan. And the Western analysts want to tell you that Iran has been weakened. They want to tell you that the United States is winning. I want you to sit with that for just a moment. Here is the game theory insight that almost nobody is presenting to you correctly. In a conflict between asymmetric powers, and this is a fundamental principle you have to understand before any of the rest of this makes sense, the weaker party does not need to defeat the stronger party militarily. The weaker party only needs to impose costs on the stronger party that exceed what the stronger party is willing or able to bear. That is it. That is the whole equation. And Iran, a country that the United States has been trying to break economically for 4 decades, a country under sanctions so comprehensive they were designed to reduce Iranian oil exports to zero, is now generating an estimated $600 million per month simply from transit fees in the Strait of Hormuz. Iran has turned the choke point it was always supposed to be afraid of into a revenue source. It has turned its own vulnerability into a weapon, and it did not do this accidentally. It did this because the escalation ladder that Washington relied on, decapitation strikes, infrastructure bombing, maximum pressure, was always structurally going to push Iran toward exactly this outcome. Now here is where China enters the picture in a way that should make your blood run cold, regardless of which side of this conflict you emotionally support. Because China, and this is the part that I have been tracking through historical pattern analysis for years, China has a doctrine. It is not written in a white paper, it is not announced at a press conference, but if you study Chinese strategic behavior over the past century, you see a pattern so consistent and so deliberate that it practically constitutes a doctrine. China does not fight wars. China creates conditions. China does not confront adversaries directly. China positions itself so that when the adversary fights someone else, China benefits. China is the third player in a two-player game, and the third player always wins. Trace the infrastructure backwards. In 2019, Iran formally joined the Belt and Road Initiative. That same year, China established a consulate in Bandar Abbas, a port city on the Persian Gulf, sitting directly on the approaches to the Strait of Hormuz. Think about that choice of location for a moment. Bandar Abbas. Not Tehran, not Isfahan, Bandar Abbas. The port that controls access to the most strategically significant waterway in the world. In 2021, the 25-year partnership was signed, locking in oil flows, technology transfers, and financial infrastructure that would allow both countries to operate outside the dollar system. In 2022, Iran was welcomed into the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, integrating it into China's security architecture. In 2023, Iran joined BRICS. Every single one of these moves, examined individually, looks like routine diplomacy. Examined together, examined through the lens of structural, historical analysis, they form something that looks unmistakably like a decade-long strategic preparation for precisely the scenario in which we find ourselves today. And now we have to talk about what is actually happening in the Strait of Hormuz, because the American media is covering it as though it is a bilateral confrontation between Washington and Tehran. It is not. What is happening is a restructuring of the global financial order in real time in one of the most economically consequential waterways in human history. Iranian transit fees are being charged in Chinese yuan. China buys more than 80% of Iran's oil. China imports approximately 40% of its total oil through the Strait of Hormuz. So when Iran controls the strait and charges in yuan, China, which publicly says it is just an innocent bystander calling for de-escalation, is simultaneously deepening the petro-yuan, bypassing the petrodollar, and demonstrating to every energy-dependent economy in the global south that there is an alternative to the dollar-based system that Washington uses as a weapon. The Strait of Hormuz has become a classroom, and the lesson being taught is that the dollar's supremacy is not a law of physics. It is a political arrangement, and political arrangements can be renegotiated. Look at what the United States is trying to do with its blockade of the strait. The Trump administration is claiming the blockade is working because 9 ships turned around. 9 ships in a waterway through which approximately 2,000 ships transit every month. The structural mathematics of this situation are catastrophic for American strategy. Even with Allied naval support, which has not materialized, maintaining a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz over any meaningful period of time is extraordinarily costly for the U.S. military, economically destabilizing for global markets, and politically unsustainable in a world where the global South is watching every single move. And while America is bleeding treasure and credibility trying to close the strait, China is quietly accelerating the China-Pakistan economic corridor, deepening its investment in the port of Gwadar, and building the transcontinental rail infrastructure that will eventually allow Chinese commerce to move overland from Xinjiang to the Persian Gulf and beyond, bypassing maritime choke points altogether. China is building the exit ramp while America argues about the toll booth. This is the pattern. This is always the pattern. When Britain was exhausting itself trying to maintain imperial control in the aftermath of World War II, America stepped in and built the new architecture. Britain fought the battle. America built the order. What we are watching right now, if you have the historical vision to see it clearly, is a structural repetition of that transition. Except this time, America is the exhausted imperial power, and China is the patient architect of the next order. The Iran-Hormuz situation is not the cause of this transition. It is a symptom of it. It is a visible manifestation of something that has been building beneath the surface of global politics for the better part of a decade and a half. And Iran? Iran is not going to give up the Strait of Hormuz. Not now. Not after this war. Not ever. Because Iran's negotiators have already added sovereignty over the strait to their formal list of demands in peace talks with the United States. Think about what that means. Think about how that sentence would have sounded to a Washington policymaker 5 years ago. Iran demanding formal recognition of its control over the Strait of Hormuz. That is not a negotiating position of a country that has been weakened. That is the negotiating position of a country that has discovered, under the pressure of existential conflict, that it has a card no one can take from it. The strait is 21 miles wide. Iran's shoreline runs the entire northern edge of it. No airstrike changes geography. No sanctions change geography. No aircraft carrier changes geography. The people who told you this conflict would bring Iran to its knees did not understand the game that was being played. They were thinking about military force ratios and sanctions lists and political pressure campaigns. They were not thinking about history. They were not thinking about game theory. They were not thinking about what happens when you corner a player who has a geography card and a superpower patron who has been quietly, patiently building the infrastructure of the next world order for the last 10 years. China planned for this, not in the sense of some secret conspiracy plotted in a dark room. Dismiss that framing immediately. That is not how grand strategy works. China planned for this in the sense that intelligent, patient, structurally minded strategists looked at the board, identified the most important pieces, and spent a decade moving them into position, while America spent that same decade fighting in places that did not matter strategically and congratulating itself for it. The result of those two different approaches to time and strategy is what you are watching right now in the Strait of Hormuz, in the yuan-denominated transit fees, in the Chinese tankers that abide by Iran's new rules, because Beijing calculated long ago that the moment would come when the rules of the game would change, and it intended to be on the right side of that change when it did.